Welcome to Perspectives from HSBC. Thanks for joining us. And now, on to today's show.
Hello, my name is Stephen King. I'm HSBC Senior Economic Advisor, and I'm delighted to welcome Sir Niall Ferguson to this HSBC Perspectives podcast. Maybe it's even a vlogcast because we're actually here in video as well. And Sir Niall, you don't really need any introduction because you're one of the most eminent historians there is at the moment. And we've been speaking really against the background of the Global Investment Summit that's been taking place in Hong Kong. And we're going to talk about all things associated with China, the US, and the rest of the world. And I wanted to kick off with something because you've made the headlines over the course of the last few weeks, partly because of a response to you by J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the US, who has described you as purveying moralistic garbage, historical illiteracy, and even worse than that, being a globalist. I know in one sense it's been very good news for you because it's given you lots and lots of publicity you might not otherwise have had. But can you just explain the background to these sort of rather aggressive comments about you as this eminent historian?
The background to the spat, I think spat is the right word.
Spat, I think, is the right word, yes, absolutely.
Bar fight, or whatever you think it was.
Punch up.
Is that I had taken exception to some things that President Trump had said about the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, that he was a dictator, that he had a 4% approval rating, etc. And I had said on Twitter, rather impetuously, that future historians would have trouble explaining to students why Republican presidents had stopped caring about the sovereignty of independent states that were invaded by dictators. And I quoted George H.W. Bush back in 1990, "This will not stand." And I accused the Trump administration of appeasing Vladimir Putin.
Of course, appeasing's a pretty strong word to use, isn't it?
Well, I suppose I should have known that I would trigger somebody, and I certainly
did.
I certainly was expecting some reaction,
yes.
But I didn't expect it to come from the Vice President. Now, the Vice President's a busy person. He has all kinds of chat groups that he has to participate in, including those discussing whether or not to attack the Houthis. So it was surprising to me that he had time to write a quite lengthy post accusing me of historical illiteracy. Now, I'm many things. I don't claim to be perfect, but historically illiterate can't really be one of them. So I needed to respond. It did surprise
me, I have to admit, when I saw that.
I responded in Glaswegian fashion, which I was raised always to retaliate,
but not with any particularly strong Anglo-Saxon language, I don't think.
I'm very careful to engage in civil discourse. That's one of my first principles.
Yeah.
And so I took issue with his categorization of my views, and we had quite a good back and forth, in fact. And it ended amicably, rather, as you might expect, a pub fight outside a Glasgow saloon bar to end. We shook hands and had, metaphorically, a drink. So I don't think we've ended on bad terms. I said, look, I don't think this is how to negotiate with Vladimir Putin. This is not how to negotiate with Russians. You don't give them what they want before the negotiations start. He said, we're not making concessions to Putin. I said, good, and now I'm watching to see how it turns out. If it turns out well, if they succeed in ending the war in Ukraine in a way that leaves Ukraine viable as an independent state, then well done. I'll be the first to congratulate them.
And reaching out to Vladimir Putin, obviously this is something which we've not seen from any recent US president. But in one sense, you, I think, believe that this is an attempt, in one sense, to peel Putin away from President Xi, that the sort of Russia-China relationship is very, very strong. But if somehow Trump and his group of people can peel Putin away, get Russia perhaps closer to the US in the future, this is something that might pay dividends for the US. How plausible is that story, do you think?
Well, Stephen, this argument is sometimes called the reverse Nixon strategy. To understand why Nixon features, you have to remind yourself what happened in 71, 72. At that time, the Nixon administration felt that it was in a weak position. It was trying to end the war in South Vietnam. It was worried about the Middle East, and it saw itself as losing the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And one of the things that Richard Nixon did was to go to Beijing to meet Mao Zedong. And this so-called opening to China was a major geopolitical breakthrough. It rattled the Soviets. But it's important to remember that the Nixon trip to China happened after the Soviet Union and China had gone to war over their common border. And so it wasn't as if Richard Nixon had to peel Mao away from Brezhnev.
Relations were already frosty.
Well, they weren't frosty. They were deeply hostile. And the great Sergei Radchenko has a terrific new book out, which shows that in the minds of both the Chinese and the Soviets, the principal division in the Cold War was not between communism and the United States. It was within communism between Moscow and Beijing.
Yeah.
So fast forward to 2025. I think it's naive to imagine that you could somehow peel Putin away from Xi Jinping by offering him an amazingly good deal in Ukraine, which seems to be the strategy. Seems, I don't know, but it seems like that's the strategy.
Yep.
Because at the moment, and this has been true now for years, the closest relationship between any two world leaders is between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. They meet very frequently. When they meet, they speak very warmly. They talk in terms that seem to me to make it quite unlikely that one of them would defect. And so I think there's a flaw at the heart of reverse Nixon. And the flaw is that you might make a very sweet deal with Putin over Ukraine. And Putin might pocket Ukraine, say, thanks very much.
Sure. Now, going back to Nixon, Nixon had the shock in 1971, which was not just about reaching out to China. It was about actually imposing tariffs on America's allies, trying to force the Germans and in particular the Japanese to revalue the exchange rates. Many people today are saying that the tariff strategy of Trump is very similar to that of Nixon in 1971. You impose tariffs not because you want to raise revenue or because you want to protect industries at home. You're trying to force other countries to change their exchange rate arrangements. Is that something that's plausible today, do you think?
It's not a terrible analogy. I mean, tariffs weren't a big part of the 1971 conversation, although trade was. I mean, at that point, the United States was under considerable pressure from Japan.
I push back on that a little bit. I think tariffs were quite a big part, but they didn't last very long.
They weren't as big a part as the currency issue.
Yes.
And what really mattered in 71, well, there were a bunch of things that they did, but the most important was to end the link between the dollar and gold. And that meant the end of what was left of the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates.
Absolutely.
And it translated into a significantly weaker dollar in subsequent years. So I think that's really the important part here. But you're right, Stephen, trade was also a reason why Nixon decided to impose the famous shock of August 1971. Now, that was a shock directed mainly at American allies, especially Japan and West Germany. And I think in the same way, a lot of Trump's trade policies shock American allies. Canada being the obvious example, but there are going to be other shocks this year for sure, because the way Trump talks represents a much bigger escalation of American tariffs than anything Richard Nixon ever contemplated. I mean, if you think about what would happen if he did reciprocal tariffs across the board, in other words, raising US tariffs on every country that has significant tariff and non-tariff barriers to US exports, we'd be going back in time to the average tariff rate of 1937. No, Richard Nixon certainly never talked about anything as drastic
and
as that.
for those people who don't know the history of the 1930s, of course, 37 itself was bad enough, but the Smoot-Hawley tariff came in 1930, which was designed effectively to protect the interests of American farmers against international competition. I suppose American farmers in the 1920s were the equivalent of American manufacturers today, needing protection from international competition. Smoot-Hawley came along. It wasn't the only cause of the Great Depression, not even the primary cause of the Great Depression, but it certainly made life a lot more difficult for countries.
Most historians would say what Smoot-Hawley did was to signal that there was going to be no relaxation, but only escalation of American protectionism, which was already pretty tough.
It was already very high,
yeah. But I think what's interesting here is that when they're trying to work out how to impose reciprocal tariffs, you'll find members of the administration explicitly saying, hey, there's legislation still in the statute books that goes back to Smoot-Hawley that we can use.
Well, happy days. I mean, that's the best way of describing it properly, isn't it?
Let me just put it this way. It's a bit counterintuitive to an historian for an administration to be citing Richard Nixon as the inspiration of their foreign policy and Smoot-Hawley as the inspiration for their trade policy. That kind of runs against the grain of conventional wisdom, since, looking back, those aren't great precedents, let's just put it that way.
I suppose you would say it shows that things are possible, even if they're not necessarily desirable.
I think
one way of putting it.
The Trump administration should not be underestimated. Part of what's interesting to me about the moment when we're speaking and when this event is happening in Hong Kong is that we've gone from a very positive assessment in the wake of Trump's election victory, a sort of bullish mood, to a much more bearish mood. Whereas we're speaking, although markets have recovered slightly, US equity markets are down significantly since their highs earlier this year. Mostly because I think of trade policy uncertainty, but also because of a general sense that Trump has taken a 4x4 to both the international trade system and the international security system, and there are people in the administration who seem to want to do it to the international currency system too. And markets are, I think, disquieted by that.
Well, I wanted to ask you something else, though, about going back to Nixon. The other comparison that a lot of people make at the moment is with the 1985 Plaza Accord.
Yeah, I think that's dead wrong.
I think it's wrong as well, but I'm interested to know why you think it's wrong.
Stephen Meehan has this paper that he published before he became chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors when he was on Wall Street that says it's not enough to do tariffs. I mean, that won't fix the problem of the global imbalances.
Yep.
We also have to do something to alter the way in which the dollar is relatively strong. How do we do that? We have all these holders of dollar-denominated bonds.
Yep.
Let's hit them with a tax.
This is sort of turning into perpetuals with zero coupons.
Yeah,
and
let's
it's kind of default, isn't it?
Well, default
everything
is,
but name.
I mean, default is one of these terms that you can be very pedantic about.
Yes.
But from the vantage point of a bondholder, being told we're going to tax your current holdings of US Treasuries and we're going to force you to convert 10 years into 100 years century bonds is certainly the kind of thing that if Argentina did it to you, you wouldn't be crazy about it.
You would not be crazy about it.
So it's a very risky thing to propose, given that the United States not only has, by general agreement, the reserve currency, but also the safe asset. The 10-year Treasury is the safe asset, which global markets price a lot of things off.
No, I agree.
So for Stephen Meehan to come along and say, hey, we should do something really radical, not just 1930s level of tariffs, not enough. We're also going to force a dollar devaluation by inflicting a haircut on bondholders and a forced conversion into longer maturities.
Yeah.
I mean, this is pretty risky stuff to do.
Yeah.
International financial markets are a very large, complex system, much more complex than they were back in 1971. And so when you say something like that, and you then get hired by the President of the United States to be the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, I think markets have actually responded in quite a restrained way.
Well, the dollar's down a fair bit from where it was, although some people put that more onto the fact that the Federal Reserve may be cutting interest rates faster than
I don't think any of
expected.
this Mar-a-Lago stuff has really been priced in.
No, I
yet.
don't think it has at all. In fact, one thing I was going to say is that people often ask me, what are the reasons why the US might lose reserve currency status? Could another currency come along to replace it? And I've often said, well, actually, it's not an issue about another currency coming along to replace it. It is much more an issue of the US abusing its reserve currency to such a degree that you end up with financial chaos. You could arguably say that's what happened in the 1970s to a degree, coming off gold, dollar collapses, really messy, high inflation, and so on and so forth. I just wonder today, similar kind of reaction, if you really were to play fast and loose with the reserve currency status, with the credibility of the dollar as the world's reserve currency, do you again then enter a world of financial chaos internationally?
Well, when people were talking last year rather euphorically about American exceptionalism, I had to
this would be
remind them
exceptional in the wrong direction.
Way. It wasn't too exceptional to be an investor in US equities in the 1970s. I mean, one has to remember that when all of these experiments were run, when the Nixon shock was administered, the consequences were adverse for investors in a lot of different ways. So US equities between Nixon's re-election in 72 and his resignation declined, get this, 46% peak to trough.
Yep.
The dollar obviously sells off, but more importantly, you have a real problem of stagflation. Now, one of the things that's important to bring into the equation is national security, is geopolitics. One of the interesting things about this administration is not only Stephen Meehan, but also Scott Bessent talk about the way in which the Trump administration is simultaneously solving for trade, for the economic side, and national security.
Yep.
So part of Meehan's argument in the Mar-a-Lago piece is you're going to get your situation improved, say your tariffs reduced, if you accept the fiscal deal, you get your bonds maturities extended.
In effect.
But the payoff is that you're in the national security America team. You're going to be under that security umbrella. I wonder if that really works.
Well, it doesn't work for China, does it? I mean, China's a major holder of US bonds and they're not exactly going to end up on the US security umbrella.
I mean that's the key question. A lot of countries just have to suck it up. If you're Canada, you can talk a good game, and Mark Carney is talking a good game, but you're still in a much weaker position than Donald Trump. So is Mexico. So is Denmark. There are lots of players who have to just jump when Donald Trump says jump and just ask how high. China's not in that position.
No, I
and
agree.
China doesn't have to accept any of this. And thus far, I think it's been very interesting to see how the Chinese government has responded, say, to the tariffs. Tariffs have gone up on China. Up now, I think, in total, if you include the Trump 1.0 tariffs, to say 36%.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
And the Chinese have retaliated. They've imposed their tariffs, but quite selectively.
Let me ask you something else, which is that you've talked from time to time about the European reaction. Obviously, you had the Munich Security Conference. Europeans, I guess, when Biden won his term in office, there was an assumption that Trump was a sort of aberration.
Yeah.
He'd been there for 4 years, he'd lost, and now we're moving on to sort of mainstream, sensible Americans leading the free world.
Adults are back in the room.
Everything was going to be absolutely fine. So, in one sense, the shock for Europe is not just that Trump turned up once. It's that you now have a Trump administration which is more powerful, more focused, more ambitious perhaps than the first administration, and which is determined to change the rules of the game for everybody else.
Yeah.
And so, from the point of view of European security, how should Europe think about itself in these circumstances?
Well, I think it's astonishing that the Europeans are shocked by what's happened, because it's not as if the Biden administration delivered any of the improvement in transatlantic relations that they hoped for.
Yep.
And this was, I think, one of the striking things about the last 4 years. The Biden people came in and withdrew from Afghanistan with almost no consultation with the other NATO countries. That was a shocker for those who were involved.
Absolutely.
They've ended the Chips and Science Act,
Yep.
which was an industrial policy that took no account whatever of European interests. And
A kind of act of protectionism, but not seen as a tariff story, but it's still an act of protectionism.
In practice,
basically
it is.
bringing investment
And it
to
was
the US and away from everywhere
and
else.
extremely bad news for Europe's hopes of being
Sure.
competitive in technology,
Yep.
particularly. Let's just look at what happened in Ukraine, because this
Yep.
is the tell, this is the revealing thing.
Yep.
When the war broke out in February 2022, the first American impulse was to simply fold and fly Zelensky out. And to the surprise of just about everybody, the Ukrainians fought and defeated the Russians in the Battle of Kyiv,
Yep.
and then proceeded to defeat the Russians in Kharkiv and Kherson in the late part of 2022. Now, at that point, the opportunity was there to try to bring the war to an end. And that would have been the right thing to do when the Ukrainians were in a strong position and the Russians were in a weak position. What did the United States do? The Biden administration said, no, this is good. Let's keep this going, because the Ukrainians are just cleaning the Russians' clocks. That's great. So let's not make any effort to end
Sure.
this. And the Europeans naively went along with it. We'll do whatever it takes. Biden said, whatever it takes. They said, whatever it takes.
It always sounds good, doesn't it?
Result-
Until you discover you can't afford to do it.
A war that had no end in sight.
Yeah.
And, if you were watching closely, a rising probability that this, along with other policy mistakes, would lead to the Democrats, whoever their candidate was, losing. The Europeans don't appear to have thought this through. They don't appear to have realised that they were putting themselves in a very weak position by allowing that war to drag on. I think
But a
it's
bit
changed in the sense that psychologically
Yeah.
there's been a shift in Germany, and with the election of Friedrich Merz as Chancellor, there is going to be a concerted effort to revive the German economy through rearmament and infrastructure investment. And the fiscal gloves are off. I think at the European level too, they finally realise this is serious.
And let me ask you something, with my economics hat on. Yeah, everyone talked after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Empire, of the so-called peace dividend.
Yeah.
Everyone talks now about the positive effect on Europe of spending on defence. But in one sense, this is the reversal of the peace dividend, isn't it? It's exactly the opposite of what people hoped for and thought they were seeing in the 1990s. I'm just sort of wondering whether it may be a short-term positive for Germany, but long-term, higher interest rates, more inflationary pressures, bigger fiscal deficits, higher levels of government debt. These are all possible implications, aren't they?
I think it's positive
this.
for Germany. I don't think it's clear that it's positive for Italy. I
Yeah.
think there's going to be, as happened after Germany.
And our country, the UK, what do you think
We'll
about
come
that?
to that in a minute, because it's a special case. So
Yeah.
after German reunification, which was pre the euro, so we had an
Yep.
exchange rate mechanism,
Absolutely.
but no single currency, huge fiscal shock. Germany spends a ton of money on bringing the 5 East German Länder into the Federal Republic. And everybody else gets caught in the crossfire because rates go up. And for France and Britain, it's unendurable.
Well, to be fair, that's a short-term effect. It lasts for 2 or 3 years. I mean, chaos in the ERM.
But it was enough, wasn't it?
It was, but then longer term, next 10 years, you have falling interest rates, falling inflation, fiscal numbers looking very, very good, actually on both sides of the Atlantic.
So the peace
under
dividend was
Clinton,
real.
it looked like, the US national debt would disappear. This is
I
a
remember those
chaotic
days.
sort of idea this would happen. Didn't happen, of course. So I fully accept that there was initial problems associated with the reunification of Germany. But thereafter, it struck me that there was a significant benefit: lower borrowing, lower interest rates, crowding in of investment in non-defense areas. That, I guess, is maybe up for grabs now, possibly going into reverse.
Well, I think the sign is reversed in the sense that the peace dividend's over and it's been over for a while. Now Europeans have to invest in national security in a way that they haven't done since the 1980s. That will have positive effects, I think, for the German economy. There's a ton of manufacturing capacity that's been underutilized as the Germans finally discovered that their wonderful internal combustion engines are no longer required in China. So there's an opportunity to retool German manufacturing. And my basic gut view is that Germany is ready to rearm and it will do it pretty well. Okay. It's not clear to me that that's great news for other parts of the European economy. Italians have a very large stock of debt. Higher rates are bad news for Giorgia Meloni. Britain's interesting because Britain did Brexit, which I always felt was an error under the circumstances. It would have been a great thing to do in, say, 1990. In an age of globalization, in an age of falling trade barriers. But in an age of increased security risks and high tariffs, Brexit starts to look very difficult.
And where you have to make choices of friends, which becomes
This
difficult.
is going to be very tough when they're offered, for example, a British-American trade deal. That will run counter to Keir Starmer's desire to get closer to Europe.
And to China, for that matter.
And it gets complicated being Prime Minister, because where do you stand? Britain's going to be drawn into this rearmament of Europe because it doesn't make sense to do it without Britain. After all, there are only 2 nuclear powers in Europe, France and Britain. And if you don't have a US blanket anymore, then you're going to have to up their nuclear capability. So a lot of very interesting consequences flow from the Trump shock. I think it'll be positive for Germany because Germany's been in a stagnant state for some years, but I think it will create new strains that we haven't seen
elsewhere in Europe,
especially for Italy.
I'm just wondering, can you leave us with some optimism for the future? Parts of the world that might be doing a little bit better, that we can sort of think might actually come out of this in a better state of mind than is the case currently? Germany, you've mentioned already. Anywhere else you might want to single out?
Japan has been one of the upside stories. South Korean defense companies and shipbuilding companies are for sure going to carry on benefiting from all of this. But the really interesting thing is, what does all this mean for China? My sense is that under Donald Trump, his strong impulse is to achieve some big, beautiful deal with Xi Jinping. He certainly doesn't look to me to be spoiling for a fight. And that seems to me to be quite positive news for those people who've been keeping their distance from investing in China in the last few years. There's a possibility, it's not guaranteed, there's a possibility that in the Trump years, relations will improve. And if that's the case, then I think you could see a significant revaluation of Chinese technology companies as American investors realize that Chimerica, the great fusion of the US Chinese economies, is still alive. That Trump hasn't killed Chimerica. To me, that's the big takeaway of the last 8 years. That tariffs didn't kill it in Trump 1.0. No. The tech war didn't kill it under Biden. It's still remarkably resilient. Americans still buy a lot of stuff from China. Decoupling, schmecoupling, it hasn't happened, even if the goods are going via Vietnam, via India, via Mexico. So although at the moment sentiment is somewhat bearish, there is a possibility that Trump ends up making Chimerica great again. That would be a great historical irony if it happens.
It would be, wouldn't it? And I'll tell you something. I was talking to someone from the first Trump administration a year or so ago, and I asked him, I said, what sort of metric would Trump use to decide whether his second term in office had been a success? He came back straight away. Very simple. Stock market. If it's up, Trump's done well. And I think that a good relationship between the US and China would certainly help to generate that kind of outcome for the stock market over the next 3 or 4 years.
If there's one thing I've learned from studying history, is that there's a lot of irony in the historical process. And so you think that Trump is a disaster for US-China relations because of stuff he said on the campaign trail. But if you look closely, it might end up being net positive for the US-China relationship. One can't be certain, especially since many members of the administration are quite hawkish on China.
Indeed.
Trump himself is a dove. That is a very important thing to bear in mind. My sense is that Donald Trump wants to do détente, not only with Russia, but also with China. And détente with China, that has to be good for investors both sides of the Pacific.
So I think what you're saying is that the art of the deal, in one sense, is still very much alive.
It is the most important book that one should read to understand Donald Trump, even though he didn't write it himself.
Indeed. Sir Niall Ferguson, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for joining our HSBC Perspectives podcast or vlogcast. It's been great talking to you. And to the audience at home, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Perspectives. Make sure you're subscribed to HSBC Global Viewpoint to stay connected